But first I wanted to give a bit of a kind of, maybe it's the global-only, but the strategic overview of how to think about China and the U.S. strategically. Bob Kapp said you need to think beyond just the narrow, and I'll just take it a little other step beyond what Bob said even. And I think that our leaders actually have always thought in kind of much bigger strategic terms than just the bilateral relationship, and it's led to some key turning points. And certainly the opening between the U.S. and China in 71, 72 was driven by strategic concerns on both sides, specifically the perceived rising power of the Soviet Union, the kind of dilemma it left China in, and the strategic concerns that we had about how to deal with the Soviet Union as well as find our way out of Vietnam. Now, and what has sort of partly motivated my thinking about how to think about China strategically in this period was some of the stuff written by the realists, even going back in the early 90s, Mersheimer in 2001, portraying a kind of notion that a rising power sort of inevitably comes in conflict with the established hegemon, and it's the tragedy of great powers that just have to go to war with each other or have conflict. This kind of notion of a kind of a determinism that was based on, I think, a view of the world that no longer stands up. And I'll explain what I mean by that. I think the neoconservatives have also had a kind of model now that they present of the authoritarian threat of China. Perhaps China will, there's one idea of sort of organize the world without the West, work with authoritarian states like Russia and perhaps Iran and others against American interests. And I think it's based on a way of thinking, a paradigm that really is out of date with how the world actually works. And I'll present my view of kind of the larger sense of the world, which I call strategic interdependence. And what I mean is that if you go back and look at the Cold War and previous conflicts in the 20th century, there was a zero-sum game between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. Out there, everything was kind of whatever gain they made was a loss to us, and vice versa. It was a real strategic competition, as the term is used, I think. And it got resolved. Fortunately, it ended with a whimper, not a bang. It ended peacefully, it ended with resolution. But it was a zero-sum game. But I don't think the world we're in today is anymore a zero-sum game. On a strategic level, I think we are deeply interdependent, and increasingly so. And I think that's been described during the day by in this really extremely interesting conference with so many ideas. I think Tom described very well that a policy that's based on what I think is based on that assumption. I think that what you have is, since the end of the U.S. China opening, I think, led to an extraordinary transformation of the world in a way that nobody really anticipated. But I think what it did, it played a role in actually bringing down the Soviet Union, leading the Soviet Union to face its own internal contradictions. It led to the end of the Soviet Empire. It led to the end of two economies. We ended up with one global economy. It accelerated globalization. It created the conditions for China to reemerge and be a force for further accelerating that globalization. And that ended up tying us together in a way that has, again, been described here today, that has really put us in a position of strategic interdependence, despite all our continuing tactical differences over many, many issues. I think the consequences of this, what I call strategic interdependence, is the end of this zero-sum competition. I think when Bush referred to China as a strategic competitor, which, according to Jim Mann, he never used that term after taking office. I think that was the notion of the kind of a zero-sum game of the world. I don't think that has all been his notion since being in power. There aren't any more strategic competitors, certainly not among the major powers. And certainly continued competition in economic realms, although that tends maybe perhaps to be more between companies than countries. But nevertheless, that goes on. There's certainly competition for political influence, soft power, et cetera. But on a larger level, there's still this interdependence you can't get away from. It's kind of I call it a strategic straitjacket. You can't go to war with each other. You can't end up with a confrontational system relationship with China. It's just, there's nothing to be gained and everything to be lost for both countries. So it's a very different world than we had. And of course, it also leads to what I would call mutual vulnerability. And we are seeing that now in spades with the global financial meltdown. As we've talked about here, our economies are so integrated and so interdependent that we're extremely vulnerable to what happens in the world economy or to each other. It's a very strange situation when you think about the old era of the Cold War, where you had this, if the other guy wins, I lose, and vice versa. Now you have a situation where we have extremely large interest in the success of the other power, and we're really threatened by its failure. If the U.S. economy goes down, China is in very deep trouble. And if China really has a great political instability, economic downturn, that's going to have a huge effect on the global economy and our economy. That's not strategic competitors where you have a vested interest in each other's success. So even though you have plenty of differences. And so I think it also puts you in a situation where you have an extremely vital common interest in maintaining the global system. Certainly we see that in maintaining the global financial system, the global economic system, global system of security. Despite all your differences, on the bigger picture, you need the game to go on, and you need to work together to make that go on. And I think you're seeing that, and you're seeing it get even more important in U.S. China relations. Has been said here by Tom, it's more and more a global relationship about global issues and not just a bilateral relationship. And I think that what you see now is you're compelled to cooperate. If you want to deal with the challenges you face, these strategic level challenges, you have to work with other powers, and particularly between the United States and China. You simply can't manage them alone. And we certainly see that in the financial meltdowns become a global problem. And even China has been helpful, maybe not in a critical way in this particular meltdown yet. But who knows, as it unravels more and there's a need for those $800 billion worth of Treasury and other debt instruments China's holding. If you're going to deal with energy security, that's a global problem. You can't solve that individually. I think those in China who thought somehow you can go out, buy some oil field somewhere and that's going to help you deal with your individual energy security problem independent of others have been quite mistaken, although I don't think the oil companies ever had that illusion. The vast majority of the oil produced by China in the Sudan is sold on the world market. It doesn't go back to China. Very little of the oil they actually pump overseas goes back to China. It just goes on the world market. That's what oil companies do. They just sell it where they can sell it. Why would you haul it all the way back to China if you could sell it to Egypt and then buy some in Indonesia or someplace? So it's not quite what it seems to be. I would raise a larger problem here that has been somewhat alluded to, but I think this is going to be the big problem of the 21st century. And that is, Goldman Sachs is now predicting there's going to be another 2 billion people in the global middle class by 2030 and continue to be adding at 90 million a year after that. The World Bank predicted that by 2030 there'd be another 800 million people in the global developing world middle class. We've seen China. I don't know what China's middle class is now. Obviously, it depends on how you define it. But it's, 300-400 million maybe. I'm not sure. But it's huge increase. And what does middle class mean? It's wonderful to bring people out of poverty, to bring them to a much better life that somewhere reflects not the level of consumption of ours, but certainly some of the better quality of life. But what does it mean for where the resource is going to come from and what's the environmental damage of consuming them? This is really a tough problem. To give you an idea on the resources, if China were to consume oil on the per capita basis of Americans, China would need about 100 million barrels a day beyond any acceptability. So this is a really big problem. It isn't going to be solved overnight, and it's not going to be solved by the United States alone. And the U.S. and China as the two biggest economies, and I think maybe Japan's number 2, I'm not sure. But in any case, as the impact on the world, I think China's got to be the number 2 economy. But in any case, certainly the biggest producers of greenhouse gases, biggest consumers of energy, we've got to take the lead, and I'll get to that later. So now to the question of climate change. Climate change is the quintessential, the mother of all transnational issues. This is the biggest challenge that we'll face in this century, I think, if the scientists are right. And as said earlier, climate change, a CO2 molecule released anywhere goes anywhere. You can't require a visa to come over your country. Just like microbes and pandemics. You can't stop them at the border and say, "I'm sorry, you're not allowed." It goes. We're all going to face the implications of it unless we terraform Mars and move ourselves off. We're in trouble. And if you look at the predictions and scientific assessments, it's not going to happen immediately, but by the end of this century, we really could face an existential challenge to civilization as we know it, with the kinds of impacts that are truly frightening in terms of sea level rise, extreme weather, drought, and you put all that together with your resource constraints, particularly in water. I mean, it's a very frightening future, and it will be dominating this century, I think. And it brings together the nexus of energy security and sustainable development along with other environmental issues. And that's the challenge we face, and you can't get around it without working together. There's no national solution to it alone, and there's no global solution without the U.S. and China. And I think that's really the crucial issue. Now, I think that we, as noted earlier, China and the U.S. are the biggest producers of greenhouse gases. Now, if you look at the scientific the IPCC and everything, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how many degrees temperature rise can the Earth sustain in its atmosphere for reach a real tipping point, a runaway climate change. There's certainly a discussion that we have to keep it before around 450 parts per million by the middle of the century in terms of CO2 accumulation, which means you got to peak total emissions in the world, global emissions, within 10 to 15 years, 50 to 80% reduction by 2050 of all global emissions, to 50% below 1990 levels, 2000 levels. A lot of uncertainty. You can argue over those things. But clearly, the point is there's going to have to be very serious reductions in total carbon emissions by the middle of the century, and starting within 15 years, we're really in trouble. And the problem is right now, business as usual scenario, the BAU scenario for the U.S. and China is quite definitely in a different direction. As noticed, we're about, between us is about 40% of all the global total of emissions right now from the U.S. and China combined. And China alone, by one study done by scientists from both the U.S. and China, it was predicted if it just stayed on the trajectory it's on, it didn't make any changes. And I don't think that's likely, and they're doing a lot. I don't want to say they aren't. But the trajectory they're on, by 2030, China could produce as much emissions as the entire world does today. So think about that. We'd all have to go we'd have to go carbon negative in the rest of the world to get on track to meet the IPCC requirements or whatever you want to cite by 2050 if China just continued doing what it's doing. Of course, we're continuing to grow too, just at a slower rate. And I think that this is really a frightening concept, a concern that we have to deal with. And so the notion that the U.S. and China can just go on business as usual, I think, is well understood in both, certainly in China. The Chinese leadership understands that doesn't work. And I think there's plenty of people, especially in the state of California, who understand that doesn't work. Hopefully the next administration, and I think either party, either candidate certainly personally gets it. How they would act, we don't know. But I think that the key is that we know we have to act, and we have to act in a very serious way if we're going to deal with this issue. And I think that we can go into more detail about the problem. The problem especially is coal, as noted. Not a single molecule of CO2 produced by any coal-fired electricity plant in the world is captured and stored. It all goes in the atmosphere. We have 52%, I think, of our electricity.
48.
Is it 40? Oh, it's only 48. Produced by coal. There's a lot of talk about going forward, although a lot of the banking houses, when they were operational, didn't want to invest in coal-fired plants because they didn't know what the future requirements were going to be about capturing and sequestering CO2 from coal-fired plants. China has plans to go as much as 750 to 900 gigawatts more of coal by 2030. Now, that's about 9 times the grid of France. And that's of additional coal. And China has they have a great, they're one of the biggest, fastest growing countries in producing in renewable energy, wind and solar, particularly wind. But if you look at what they want to do, 30, 40 gigawatts of wind, 30 maybe gigawatts of solar, maybe 50, 60 of nuclear, all looks very impressive until you get that 900 of coal. And where the requirement, and of course India is growing as fast as it can using coal. So coal is going to be the big challenge. It's the big monster in the closet, and we're not at this point really doing anything serious about it. We know that carbon capture and sequestration is a whole thing we can go into. It's expensive. It's an ugly technology. It's a mess. We have done work on it. So the Chinese, the Europeans, Australians, but we have not gotten close to anything deployable to do something about coal. But in any case, the point is we have to cooperate with China as well as move forward nationally in our own policy if we're going to get anywhere on dealing with this, what is a really going to become increasingly seen as an overarching threat to all of our societies in the 21st century. And I think that if we fail to do that, we're going to be in deep trouble. And I think even if you look at the U.S.-China relationship, I think it may, to some degree, hinge on whether or not we actually can cooperate. We'd be finger pointing at each other because pointing at each other is failing to take steps, or it'll be a basis, a real foundation for future cooperation and strengthening the overall relationship and trust. But it's going to be a very serious issue for both countries. And there are a lot of obstacles to this, obstacles that are part of the whole question of Sino-American relations, but I think there's still strategic suspicions on both sides. People say, oh, China's doing nothing, and why should we do anything here? I don't think it's true China's doing nothing, but that's being said. Chinese would think it's all a plot by the United States to keep them from growing, to bring up climate change. We have domestic politics on both sides to worry about. There's nationalisms, there's all the trade disputes in Taiwan. All these things are still going to exist. And they've been managed very well. I appreciate very much what Tom said today, and I think he laid out what the administration, I think the greatest success of the Bush administration has been how it's managed its relationship with China and really moved it forward. And I think that's going to, and the 10-year plan and the SED, they really created a foundation for moving forward much more seriously with China in the future on this. But we have to move forward on a much bigger scale than anybody is contemplating now for really going to make a big difference. And in fact, I would say, I'm getting the 2-minute warning here. Do we get a timeout at 2 minutes? And then, I would just make one quick point is I think we need to reprise the impact we had in our opening between the U.S. and China 40 years ago and be the ones to lead by example, by what we do to the strategic transformation of the 21st century into a low-carbon, sustainable economy on a global scale. We could do it. We need to do it. We have to take the initiative to do it. And I'm working with the Asia Society now to prepare a plan. I was in China last week vetting this report, kind of a roadmap of how to move forward between the U.S. and China on cooperation on climate change, and both a kind of framework for it as well as a series of initiatives in coal, renewable energy, energy efficiency, transportation, the areas we need to work together to scale up. A lot of good work has been done over the last 30 years. The first climate change agreement with China was 1987. In 1979, we set the MOU that led to cooperation on clean coal. We've been at it a long time, DOE, EPA. A lot of good stuff has gone on, but it doesn't get scaled up. Often the funding gets cut by Congress. We don't seem serious. We've pulled out of things we agreed to. But the basis is there are a lot of terrific people, a lot of NGOs. We need to scale it up really big time if we're going to have the kind of impact we need to have and move forward quickly. So that's what our initiative is about, which we plan to put on the desk of the president-elect and hope that we can help move this whole thing forward. So I want to kind of glibly sum up with what I call the 3 MADs. We still have mutual assured nuclear destruction, even though Jay is doing everything he can to make it less and less likely. And certainly the political conditions for it hopefully have long passed, but the use of nuclear weapons would still be cataclysmic, and that still exists, and it certainly exists between the U.S. and China. That's one reason why you don't want to go to war with China, that alone, is they both have nuclear weapons. Secondly, we have economic mutual assured destruction now. And I think we've seen in the last week or two that that's not just a slogan. You see that we're all in it together in a way that it has its upside and has its downside. And if we figure out how to work together to solve this. The Europeans, in fact, the EU really disappointed me when you had the initial reaction by the Irish and others. If one group of nations should have been able to get together and say, we're in this together, let's find a common solution, it should have been the EU. And they didn't at first. Now maybe they're pulling it together in a way they should. But that's still on the table. And I think the third one we have, I'll glibly call mutual assured climate destruction. That if we don't work together, we're going to face the kind of collective crisis that none of us wants to see. And the consequences are far worse than a financial meltdown, because the kind of change that can take place in the climate could last for millennia, not a matter of months or years. And what it will do to human habitation of the planet, from what the scientists say, is something we really don't want to find out if they're right about. If the risk is 5%, that's enough to be concerned about. So I will end with a quote from one of your colleagues across the town, Jared Diamond, from Collapse. He says, "The world's environmental problems will get resolved. in one way or another within the lifetimes of the children and young adults alive today. The only question is whether they will become resolved in pleasant ways of our own choice or in unpleasant ways not of our choice, such as warfare, genocide, starvation, disease, epidemics, and collapses of societies. So that's the choice. And we're in it together, and we have to figure out how to act together on it. So